Well, I tell you, that's a great question. It's certainly always a risk. What's good is bad and what's bad is good. That's where we were coming out of the financial crisis, and everybody's worried about over-accelerating. But I think the environment's changed, particularly when it comes to companies like big tech. You're dealing with a situation where these things aren't even remotely priced into their future growth. Technology is the largest single growth trend of our lifetime. And as the world re-engages, the decisions you make now set the tone for your portfolio for the next 5, 10, even 20 years. So it's very important to be in the game right now, even though prices are flirting with new time highs.
That's what I was going to say. So we're seeing, when it comes to big tech, really high valuations, Keith. Do you think that big tech's still the biggest opportunity out there for investors?
There's no question in my mind that that's the case, because these companies, if you look at it, are 30, 40, 50, even 60% growth year over year. Now, granted, the bar was so low you could limbo under it to begin with coming out of COVID, but that does not change the fact that the world needs what they make. The world has to have what they make. And everybody, for example, in the gig economy uses what they make. We're talking about a time where only 30% of the cloud activity reflects the work we do. Imagine what that does when it goes to 50%, 60%, 70% a couple years from now. The numbers are going to explode.
So, Keith, were you part of that rotation out of big tech and into cyclicals that we saw at the beginning of this year? It seems like things have stabilized a little bit there right now, but what was your position, and what do you like within big tech at the moment?
No, actually, I took the opposite approach, and I put out a memo to my clients to say the herd always gets this bet wrong, and they did, again, because big tech is once again going to the head of the class, and it's outperforming any of those cyclical trades. And the reason is people got so focused on the details, Alexis, they lost sight of the big picture. The big picture is the world is opening, the economy is reengaging, money is cheap, and there's a lot of it to go around. There are still great companies. So I actually went in heavier onto many of the big tech names we're talking about today. And they're still, it's like riding a winning horse in the middle of the race. They're still my favorites. Apple, Microsoft, Palantir, even though it's getting beaten to smithereens, has yet to see its potential.
And Keith, when it comes to owning big tech, obviously there's the threat of a government crackdown, but we've seen these CEOs go on Capitol Hill so many times. They're prepared. They have their advisors, their teams, and they don't really trip up in front of those lawmakers. So do you think that that's no longer a threat to big tech, even if they're called in for more hearings on Washington having to do with potential monopolies?
I tell you what, this is not going to make me any friends inside the Beltway, but you know, the Washington politicians are outmaneuvered, outlawyered, outguessed, and out-technologied every single time they try to go to bat. The idea is right. You can argue that big tech needs to be reined in. There's no question about that. But I don't think it's going to amount to much. They tried this with Microsoft. They tried this with the Bell system. They tried this with numerous other companies. And every single time, the markets sorted out, not the politicians.
Now, Keith, we saw Biden's first 100 days in office. Today marks the 100th day. There's a lot of big government in there, a lot of big spending, and a lot of plans to tax the rich, including raising the capital gains tax to more than 43%. What's your take on the impact that's going to have on investment going forward, if any? I ask because we saw that quick knee-jerk reaction to the downside, and then markets seem to shrug it off.
Well, I think the markets are going to try their best to shrug it off, but I think that this is going to be the law of unintended consequences at its best. History shows very clearly that this is a popular idea, but it has never worked since the dawn of time. So where does that come down for an investor? I think you've got to constantly play forward. There's things you can control, like which stocks you buy and why, and things you can't, like what the government's going to do next.
And Keith, how worried do you think investors are of an impending capital gains tax or more taxes when it comes to investing?
That's a tough call because you really don't know who holds what. You don't know what's in retirement plans. You know, so there's a lot of conjecture that people are going to sell off if the capital gains tax goes higher. I'm not sure that's true because I think many of the big liquid stocks are in fact held in retirement accounts where that kind of stuff doesn't matter. So to me, the real question is going to be what he does with making taxes retroactive, potentially what gets put on the table with the use of pass-through trusts, death taxes. Those kinds of things are issues that I really worry about. And ultimately, I think the government will make a play for our retirement assets because you're talking about $17, $20 trillion they haven't got their meat hooks into yet.
Yeah, there's a lot of money at stake there. Hey, Keith, what are you doing in terms of inflation and hedging inflation, which we see in all the economic data is, running hotter and hotter?
You know, that's an interesting question because, again, my take on that is a little bit different than the average bear. The issue is really not inflation, it's deflation because the government doesn't measure it properly and they have every incentive to keep the numbers low, which is why you and I experience things like medicine or our breakfast that cost 60% more than they did 5 years ago. The way around that is to buy companies whose growth rate and products can constantly be adapted and margins can be maintained, chief among which, ironically enough, given our earlier discussion, is big tech.